Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the May Lee Show. I hope everyone is doing well. It is Christmas week, and I was actually thinking about not doing an episode this week and taking some time off. Just because it's the holidays, and I figured everybody else is celebrating the holidays, but then I was like, we're still in the middle of COVID-19. Everyone's home. And we're still worried about a lot of things. So I thought, why not do an episode that was holiday like and talk about something that everyone can connect to? And that's like baking, and making really yummy treats during the holidays. And believe it or not, I know I joke about this all the time that I don't cook and I don't bake. And, I experiment sometimes. Usually my oven is used as a shoe rack, things like that. But believe it or not, during the holidays, I actually do bake. It's a tradition that I started years ago, and I make Christmas cookies. Sometimes they're really basic. And so this year was no different. I decided to bake over the weekend. So here are some of the cookies I made. I mean, they're very elementary, right? But I made like ginger cookies and then sugar cookies and, decorated them. This is a little gingerbread man. I'll tell you about the cookie cutter in a second. And then I did something different. I found this bourbon ball recipe. And I was like, bourbon balls? That sounds interesting. I don't even drink bourbon. But I was like, I'm going to make them. Look at these. I know they look like kind of pieces of poo, but believe it or not, they're really good. It's bourbon and then crushed up like Nabisco chocolate animal crackers and pecans that are crushed up and like confectioner sugar. I mean, it's really basic. And then you let the dough sit overnight. And then you make them into little balls and then roll them up in confectioner sugar. And bam, you got like a bourbon ball that you can get hammered on. It's awesome. But anyway, that was my experiment. But I'll tell you this little cookie cutter has been in my family since I think I was like 2 or 3, honestly. My mom has kept these little cookie cutters, and this little gingerbread man seriously is as old as I am almost. And so I use him every year. Isn't he cute? He's like so old school. So that was my cookie excursion over the weekend. So the reason why I'm telling you guys about my cookie baking adventures is because this episode, I wanted someone to come on to talk about baking and the beauty of baking and the art of baking, but then also, what it does to all of us because it's so universal. And I started researching Asian bakers, right? And I looked on Instagram and online, and I came across this woman named Jasmine Cho. And her story was so amazing. It wasn't just like she made cute cookies. She's a cookie activist. She uses her baking skills to talk about historic figures in the AAPI community and current figures as well. And she creates these cookies that are so beautiful and such works of art. And now she also wants to pursue the idea of baking therapy, right? Because look, again, I don't bake a lot, but it is therapeutic when you bake because you're creating something so delicious and beautiful and everybody enjoys. So I just found this woman so fascinating. I'm like, I got to get her on the show for this episode. She's so perfect. So she joins me now from Pittsburgh, where she's based. Jasmine, hi, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
I am too. And I got to tell you, fellow Korean American, we got to mention that. You have such an interesting story because it wasn't like you, since you were a kid, wanted to be some star baker or anything like that. It wasn't until, I guess, high school that you discovered it through a friend of yours, right?
Right, right.
And so what was it initially that you found so fascinating about baking? And then we're going to talk about what you do now, but something must have intrigued you at that point.
Well, actually, it does start a little bit before high school in terms of my love for baked goods,
Okay.
eating them and consuming them. And I like to mention that, I feel really blessed that I grew up in a family environment where treats were embraced
Yeah.
as what they were kind of meant to be, celebratory. So I remember like one of my strongest childhood memories is of my dad coming home with like 5 pints of ice cream and
Oh.
like ice cream cake and ice cream pies when I was really sick with a high fever. So,
Oh.
like there was not really a lot of guilt associated with sweets and treats like that. Like I
Right.
know some people have that kind of experience, but I think because of that, my love for baked goods started very early on, and just serendipitously, my friend at the time in high school, her mother had taught her to bake, and then she basically passed on those lessons to me, which again was a huge blessing. And so, because it was like a moment where I was able to create something that I love to consume so
Yeah.
much, was that much more like magical to me.
Right.
And it felt very accessible, I guess, also because I had a friend guiding me every step of the way, and like just even teaching me how to measure flour the way her mom had taught her. And so it just made it very easy. And I'm like, oh, like I can totally do this. And that's kind of what started my whole journey into baking by myself too, and just trying things out and not having fear to hold me back.
Yeah, well, clearly you don't have fear with your cookie making because these are beautiful works of art, and the messages that you're trying to get across with these cookies is so powerful. And again, we're going to get to that. But even then, when you discovered the beauty of baking and how it's done, were you thinking? Was it? Did something trigger inside of you saying, you know what, I think I can make a career out of this, or were you still thinking, yeah, this is going to be a nice hobby of mine?
Right. It really remained a hobby for most of my, well, now I'm like most of my life, but now I forget sometimes how old I am now.
You're still
Like,
young, my dear. You're still young. I'm still your onni for sure. Or maybe you can even call me Ajima at this point. So yes.
no, onion. I would say I also the fact that, again, I guess this could resonate with you growing up in a Korean immigrant household. Baking or the arts were not necessarily encouraged as a
Right.
first choice career. And so I never even, I guess, I never had the opportunity to even fathom that it could be a plausible career. But I took actual realistic steps toward it becoming a career after I graduated from a program that was called AmeriCorps.
Mhm.
Specifically, it was Public Allies Pittsburgh. And that program, one of their core values was focusing on assets. And really, that value had to do more with a community and trying to basically recognize what assets are already existing within a community and how to amplify those assets versus going in and trying to create something new.
Right.
So I basically applied that value to myself and try to assess, all right, what like talents and passions are already existing within me that I could possibly amplify. And my passion for pastries was, at the top.
Okay.
Around 2010 is when I was like, all right, let me try this and see if it could be more than a hobby. And I ended up, creating YouTube videos because I had no other culinary education or work experience. And that became my portfolio, which I submitted to local bakeries to get a job. And,
Yeah.
whole story starts from there.
So but then it means you really were naturally gifted at this art form because you didn't go to culinary school. It's not like you went to baking school or anything like that, besides learning from your friend and her mother. But so you had a knack for it.
Yeah.
So did you have artistic skills? Had you taken art classes? Because your cookies, seriously, it's incredible what you create.
Thank you so much. It's interesting because I did always have sort of a knack, as you say, for visual art. And I particularly really enjoyed drawing portraits of people. Like, this whole everything I do is about representation and seeking out role models that whose lived experiences mirror my own. And so I remember growing up in LA, I had access to a bunch of like K-pop magazines, and I
Uh,
flipped. I love like drawing their portraits. So I didn't really connect that until afterwards, but I was like, oh, it makes sense that I used to love sketching portraits and now I
oh.
just do it on top of a cookie canvas
Got
instead.
it. Okay, so you were like my brother. He used to doodle a lot,
Yeah.
and his doodles were amazing, just naturally amazing. So you were inspired with the K-pop, which reminds me, when I was doing a little bit of research on you, I stumbled upon the Character Media article
Oh,
that they did on you, and you had entered into a contest in
right.
2010, I think. And it was the
Yeah.
delicious K-pop battle that you submitted, Korean crazy K-pop entry. And it's
Yeah.
you baking in the kitchen, and
Right.
then you do this time lapse stuff with all of these cookies of K-pop bands.
JYP. 2PM.
It was so clever, Jasmine.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really funny to look back on that video now too, because I feel like, again, you mentioned having a knack, but you can see how much my cookie like artistic skills have changed and evolved since that point. So
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, like, compared to what you do now, it looks a little bit more sort of basic, and yet, though, you can see that you
yeah,
had this talent clearly, right?
thank you.
It was so cute then, you're singing the K-pop songs, it's adorable, and you look like a little baby. I mean, you look so young here. You look young now, but you really look young back there
Yeah,
in
I
the
look a
video.
lot younger.
It's adorable, it's adorable.
Thank you
Well,
so much.
so then you okay, so then you decide, "All right, I'm gonna try I'm gonna make a go of this and try to create this cookie business," and you do, right? Yummyholic,
Yes.
right? And you make these beautiful cookies. People are ordering them for, different parties and all that, and people want their portraits. But then you realize there's got to be something more I can do
Yeah,
here, right? And
exactly.
that's when your worlds collided with cookies and baking, but
Yes.
then your realization of identity and especially the AAPI
Yes.
identity, right?
Right.
Tell me about that aha moment for you and then how you were so inspired to say, you know what, I'm going to combine these two worlds of mine.
Right. So actually, that question of how can I intersect social justice with baking was at the very beginning when I created Yummy Holic.
Mhm.
But the way that I approached it initially was just to ensure that I had some sort of charitable partnership that was, designed into my business model. And so at that point, I had chosen a specific nonprofit that I would regularly donate to, but the face cookies didn't come until maybe like 6 months into launching my business. So it was early 2016, maybe. And that was when I first started hand drawn face cookies. And it just came about because my friend was like, "Could you put my face on a cookie for my birthday?" And I was like, "Let me give it a shot." And those cookies went viral. And so I was like, "Oh, you know what? People are really paying attention to these cookies more than anything else." And that was my aha moment. I was like, "Oh, how about I start, making face cookies of people who I want more people to pay attention to and learn
Right.
about." And so I think it was that summer of 2016 when I first did a very intentional cookie gallery featuring specifically Asian American movers and shakers from the Pittsburgh region who I really wanted to see more in our media.
Right, right. And obviously that caught on too. But I think what's really interesting about your story is sort of the self-reflection and, the your own awareness that was awoken
Right.
by doing this because some of these people that you feature from
Mhm.
historic AAPI, characters, you didn't know about either. And I remember reading in several articles where you realize, man, I don't even know about my identity
Right.
and my own AAPI history,
Yes.
which I think a lot of us can relate to. A lot of us, if we are honest, we will admit, yeah, we don't know a lot about our own history. Part of the
Right.
reason is because it was never taught in school,
Yeah.
right? And we were marginalized.
Right.
And you often have described your experiences growing up as being made to feel invisible. And I
Mhm.
have often talked about that by myself, growing up in Ohio in the
Right.
70s and 80s, talk about being invisible and not no one even knowing what Korea,
Yeah. Yeah.
was, right?
Right. Yeah.
So you went through that as well. Even growing up in LA and then of course moving to Pittsburgh, you experienced that feeling of being marginalized, being made to feel invisible.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what you just said about like people not even knowing Korea. I've shared this before where even growing up in LA as a little, in elementary school, I had a bunch of Asian American friends, but I was the only Korean American,
Mm.
interestingly. And so I was always asked, like, are you Chinese? And then it was like, are you Japanese? And then when I kept saying no, they'd be like, well, what are you then? Like,
Yep.
Korea was not even like on people's minds at that time, when I was growing up. So that even in that kind of experience too made me feel like, well, why don't people know about the country that, I mean, my first language was Korean in my own household because my parents are immigrants. So it was something so familiar to me, and it just was, as a child, you're just wondering like,
Why don't
why
people
doesn't
know?
no, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah. So that obviously influenced you growing up, with the sense of maybe lack of identity or questions about identity. And
Right.
so then when you get to this point of being able to use your skills to not only educate yourself, but then
Right.
obviously educate the greater public, that must have been, I mean, I would think that that was a moment where like, "Oh my gosh, I finally figured out what I'm meant to do." Right?
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I'm still like processing all that, to be very
Are you?
honest. I always considered it a blessing to be able to pursue something that gives me joy, just in baking itself, that that can be a living for me. But then to now also infuse something even deeper, that's kind of, I guess, more of a life purpose or mission,
Yeah.
that also like impact others in such a profound way. Yeah, I feel just very blessed. Yeah.
Yeah, no, no, no. I always say, when you can find your purpose in life, and be able to live that out, what a great, wonderful feeling and blessing to have that, right? Because we all want to have some sense of purpose while we're here. And for you, you're doing it in such a fun, artistic way that people,
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I was thinking. Wow, it must be such a joyful thing for you,
Mhm.
as a baker, to be able to create something that is guaranteed to make everyone smile.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it elicits a feeling of like joy and like, wow.
Yeah, I always say I firmly believe that cookies are the most disarming medium possible. They're so inviting. Yeah, I mean, they're so harmless. And I have very, very rare people who, there's always haters throughout the world, but I think that it's harder to get so angry about
You
cookies.
cannot hate a cookie. I'm sorry. That's just not possible. So, yeah, yeah.
Right.
So, let's talk about some of the people that you have featured, and some of the figures because they are, incredible figures. And again, some of whom we have no idea who they were before you introduced them. So, how did you go about picking some of these people to feature? For instance, I love the story of, Betty
Yes. Yeah.
Ong.
Actually, I have her cookie right
Oh,
here.
good. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Coincidentally.
Okay. So you
So this
say you say the name Betty Ong to the average person, people had no idea who she is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember how I came across her story, but I think I might have just simply Googled, Asian Americans from 9/11, or like Asian American heroes 9/11. Like, I said it in my TED talk too, but it really is like, it's a privilege when your history is part of core curriculum. For the rest of us, we have to go digging. And truly, I talk about, I'm constantly excavating stories that relate to, Asian American and Pacific Islander history. And so
Yeah.
it's the same thing. I had to search for the stories, but I came across Betty Ong's story. And yeah, I mean, you don't hear about any people of color being on the hero side when we memorialize 9/11. And
Yeah.
it was her call that I understand led to the nation's first shutdown of all domestic flights, which potentially saved hundreds of other lives that day.
Right.
And It's very moving. Every time I tell her story, I'm always moved because especially her last words being, pray for us,
Oh,
and just so powerful. And I chose to also, I came across her story fairly recently too. Maybe it was 2017 or 18. And at that time, I was also really struggling with feelings because we were now in a, under 45s administration.
yep.
And, our country's uh, the environment was so different where I felt very nervous when I saw a high concentration of American flags, very different from 9/11 when the American flag brought up more feelings of
Unity.
true, yeah,
Unity. Yeah.
exactly.
Yep.
Now, like in just a few years ago, I felt like the more American flags I saw, the more nervous I got. It somehow connected to hate
Jasmine,
and
you're not alone in feeling that
yeah,
way. I think a lot of
right.
us, because as I was talking to some other friends of mine, I said, I feel like the American flag has been hijacked
Yes.
for
Oh my,
negative purposes.
right. What
And
a way to
yeah,
put that,
yeah,
especially, again, connecting to Betty Ong's story. That's why when I featured her first, I deliberately chose to have her portrait against an American flag background because,
yeah,
again, she truly was an American
yeah,
hero. And
yeah,
I wanted
yeah.
to reclaim it.
I know that her family saw that, right? And I know the reaction was, very emotional.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah. I've been
yeah.
very honored anytime I connected with, relatives of folks. Yeah, it's been very powerful for
What
sure.
what other cookies do you have in front of you that you can show me?
I have several actually. I don't know. So this one is also, this is Sammy Lee,
Yep.
Korean American. I really wish I learned about him sooner too, again, because he's specifically a Korean American role model who broke so many barriers. But not only that, his story really struck me because he was redlined. And I think redlining is something that people are still learning about. I only learned about redlining a few years ago as
Yeah.
well. But, people of color, specifically Black folks, but including people like Sammy Lee, were not allowed to buy homes in certain areas. They
Right.
were literally under a red line, and,
Yep.
realtors would be like, no, we can't sell to you. And he, at that time, was already like an Olympian and an army doctor, a decorated army doctor. So it's just, his story is just,
It
it's
is. And
something,
I didn't know about his story either until I started researching you and then your cookies. And then I
right.
read about him. I'm like, oh my God, I had no idea. So Sammy was a diver, Olympian
Yes,
diver. He
yes,
couldn't go to the public pools to practice on days when no people of color were allowed to go. So he could
exactly.
only go once a week or something like that when the pool would
Right,
open for only people of color.
right,
And
right.
other days he would be practicing into a sand pit
Exactly.
to
Which is,
dive.
yeah, it's so wild. I can't even
I
picture that,
I can't
but
either. I'm like, how does he not break his legs doing that? But that's the extent he went to become a gold medal diver.
right,
That's an incredible story that nobody hears about, certainly not in textbooks.
right,
And
exactly.
so you doing this on a cookie,
Yeah.
it's amazing that that's how the story is getting out to at least some people.
Yeah, actually, that, I think that's probably one of the most rewarding things that has happened over the last couple of years as my work has received more attention, is that I was starting to get all these random messages from middle school students on
Oh,
Instagram, like across the country. And apparently, there was some sort of like lesson plan that was built about my cookies. And so they were, like you said, they were learning not just about me, but they're more importantly learning about all these like lesser known stories and historical figures.
right.
And so it is kind of they're making their way into curriculum now, which is so, so rewarding. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Well,
yeah.
okay. Show me another cookie you have in front of you.
So another series that I did earlier this year. This is a series of four cookies actually, but they are the portraits of nurses from Wuhan. And
Wow.
yeah, and this again, this was like right in March as the anti-Asian racism was really starting to escalate. And
Right.
I was just very moved by like their battle scars from wearing masks
That's
all day,
And I
and
remember seeing those photos, in the media, and
right.
everybody was like, "Wow, look at that. They're wearing their masks for so long that they literally have sores and, and scars." But
Right.
so you
And
so you were inspired by those stories and decided to
yeah,
make these portraits.
specifically also to sort of counter or like just I wanted people to I know when I shared these initially, I just wanted to remind people that the same faces that you're condemning and that you're fearful of are the faces who are working
Right.
tirelessly to fight against this virus.
Right.
So yeah, that was a series that I did back in March.
I love
Uh,
that series. Yeah.
Thank you. Sometimes I do fun, like famous people just for fun. Like this is Ali Wong,
Oh my god,
quarantine.
I love her.
This is based on a selfie she took, like of her quarantine,
Oh,
like hair and
I
like
totally remember that on Instagram. Oh my god, that is exactly what she looked like. That's
yeah.
hilarious.
So one of the greatest opportunities I had this year also was working a lot with CAM, Center for Asian American Media,
Yep.
and so this was a demo during CAM Fest earlier this year that
That
I had done,
is
and with her
awesome.
I also ended up doing Keanu
Oh,
Reeves.
no way. From, Always Be My Maybe?
Yes, yeah,
Yes!
I that movie just gave me so much life.
Oh my god, I love that movie so much.
Yeah. And this cookie is actually really special to me because it came, Always Be My Maybe, I think was last fall when it came out.
Yes.
And right before I did this, last year was insane for me. Everything happened last year. And so I was in school full time too. And I was just like, go, go, go. And I remember my brother asking me, like, what are you doing for fun? And I remember thinking, like, like
Yeah.
I didn't know what to say. And then I watched Always Be My Maybe, and I just enjoyed it so much. And I said, you know what, I'm going to do this just for fun. And I did a whole little it's actually a stop motion series
Oh, it
with it
is?
of him getting punched in the face,
Oh my
based
god,
on the
yes.
movie.
Yes,
So
yes, yes. God, that is such a likeness of him. Okay, let's talk about how you make these cookies. I mean, the beauty of what you do is you share it on Instagram, and you sometimes show the videos of the creation of these cookies. But
right.
man, I gotta ask you, like, how long does it take you to make a cookie like that? Because that's a lot of artistic, specificity and detail.
Yeah, yeah. So each cookie definitely can take up to anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. That's only like a sit down straight through time, but I typically end up doing them over several days because I first have to like base coat, and I want it to be completely dry before I put the next layer on. Base coating just means, like, for example, I would just have put her face coloring down,
Okay.
wait that dries completely before I then go back over and start painting in the details over the
Right.
base layer of the cookie. So it really is a multi-day process. But if I try to calculate the actual time I'm sitting in front of the cookie, it's probably a few hours per cookie. And you can't really erase on a cookie. So like I used to freehand everything, but with the volume that I started doing, what I'll do is either I'll use a photograph directly, or I'll try to actually do everything freehand first on paper, and then
Wow.
I will do it in such a way where the details of the face are kind of line drawing simplified,
Okay.
which helps me then project it onto the cookie, and then I can sort of lightly trace with a little bit of food coloring first, and then I can get rid of the projector and start like going on top of that with icing and all the other paint details that I put on top of
But
it.
it's still done by hand. It's not
Yes.
like you're using a
Oh, yeah, yeah.
machine to, like,
No,
punch out
no.
these faces, right?
Oh, no.
So right, so it's still time consuming. So if you
Yes.
have a big order, are you
Mhm.
doing it all on your own?
Yes.
Holy
Which is
moly.
why I've actually stepped quite away from doing custom orders. This year, specifically, I sort of try to shift more to workshops and speaking
Okay.
because it was starting to sort of rob the joy from my work.
Mm,
I mean, again, because everything is done by hand, I started feeling like a machine, but I'm
yeah,
a human being, So
right.
it was just really labor intensive, and I wanted to. It's when I was in Yummyholic and trying to figure out whether I could expand on that business, my biggest sort of block was how do I delegate this work, because it's so custom,
Right.
that it was difficult for me to replicate, just as one human being.
Right.
So, yeah, I've kind of stepped away from just custom cookie orders.
So
Yes.
each piece is like a work of art then. I mean,
Yeah.
it's very individual and it's like
Yeah.
you do maybe just one of each
Yeah.
thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's why I have noticed that some of your creations are framed. You literally
Yes.
frame
Yeah.
them and then they're displayed in, different galleries or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think that was also one of the more exciting things that happened this year is that several of my portraits were just exhibited with the National Portrait Gallery here in Pittsburgh at the Heinz History Museum. So
Yeah.
it's always kind of a goal of mine to sort of push the idea that these really are works of art. They happen to be edible, but why
Yeah.
not with the museum audience too?
Now, did you coin the term cookie activist? Because I love that.
I don't know if I mean, that's like whenever I hear things of being coined, like, I don't know, like somebody else might have used it at the same time, but I never heard of it until I started speaking it into existence,
I
I
know,
guess.
I haven't heard of it either, and, I know that you did a TED Talk in Pittsburgh that,
Mhm.
also went viral, and I'm sure that probably brought a lot of attention after you did that, but it was such a again, you're thinking, "Oh, look at this pretty young Korean American woman here to talk about cookies," but then it's so deep what the again, the history of how you became this cookie activist and the
Right,
power of the cookie through, what you do to get people educated and
yeah,
informed.
right.
So I bet that was probably another momentous time for you when you did that TED Talk.
Definitely. I mean, whew, that was I'm like going back to that moment where I walked onto the stage and there was like over 900 people in the audience. It was
Oh,
my
wow.
first like speaking engagement at that level, and you can't see it in the actual TED talk, but I did kind of go blank for a couple seconds and it was edited out, but
Oh,
I get nervous and I blanked out for a few seconds before I continued on. But
no. Oh,
yeah, that also was last year. That led to NPR, and then NPR led to CBS this morning, and like everything. And
yeah.
it was just really wild. I was grateful that I think what was most surprising is I heard from people all around the world.
Oh,
And,
nice.
I talk about Asian Americans, and I figured my people who it would resonate most with were specifically Asian Americans. But I was proven very wrong by hearing from people all across the country that resonated with the more broader topic of feeling unseen and
Yeah.
underrepresented and excluded. And so that was incredibly moving and encouraging, and just I was glad that it echoed with so many people.
No, and having doing what I do in my area in media, it is surprising when you start talking about Asian issues, Asian American issues, but then Asian issues overall, that it is a universal
Yes.
connection that we all have of these some negative experiences, some positive, but it really is something that we have to be more aware of that we are a bigger community than we think.
Oh,
And there's
yeah.
power in numbers and there's power in sharing our
Yes.
experiences, both the good and the bad, and
Yeah.
that elevate our voices. That's what brings us together and saying, okay, we're not alone. It wasn't
Right.
just me who felt invisible, right?
Yeah.
And so
Absolutely.
through what we can do in our various areas, you obviously with cookie, me with, media, we can make that difference of making people feel like they belong.
Yeah.
And educating the greater public to
Yes. Yeah.
say, we're here, right?
Yeah.
And we're not going to be silent.
Yeah.
We are a presence and you should take us seriously.
Right.
So yeah, so that's why I can share that experience. It's sometimes surprising that you hear from people, not just locally, you hear from them all over the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So I know now also, Jasmine, that you are wanting to do baking therapy, like art
Right.
therapy, right? So that's something that you're pursuing heavily and you want to use again your skills to be able to do that. So tell me about that pursuit and how you plan on, bringing that to the public?
Yeah, so I very briefly mentioned how I ran into sort of a block with Yummy Holic where I didn't know how to expand it because I didn't know how to replicate it on a greater scale.
Yeah.
And so at that point, I was also contemplating going back to school because as I was deep in this small business, mode, I it was really difficult, like all entrepreneurs will know that you run into a ton of internal struggles too. It's not just money issues, but I don't know, for me, there was a lot of like, I guess because I'm a creator too, I'm putting a lot of, these are like personal artworks that I continue to put out. And so I just went through a lot. And what was most healing to me was the actual creating,
Mm,
making the cookies and making the cookie art was what kept me going.
yeah.
And this is, that I think I never was very conscious of how therapeutic it was. But at that point, because I was so stressed, probably, I was like, you know what? Like, I'm only able to continue moving forward because I'm getting rejuvenated and re energized by these cookies.
Yeah.
And so that's when I started questioning. I wonder if there's like something called bake therapy out there. And as I started Googling again, I came across art therapy
Yep.
and what's called creative expressive arts therapy. And those felt the closest to what I was imagining baking could be. And it just really connected with me easily too, because I've been approaching baking as little pieces of artwork. And so I went back to school, and now I'm currently in Pratt Institute's program for art therapy and creativity development. And yeah, I'm hoping that I could. Uh, Create or sort of legit. I mean, I think everybody knows if you love baking, you intuitively understand that it's very healing,
Yes.
but love to back it with some sort of research to
Some data.
almost validate it even
Yeah.
more, with the purpose of hopefully driving funds to it to make baking and the kitchen a more accessible space in healing organizations and centers. So that's sort of the big, like, 10-year vision, I guess, is to.
I think it's an amazing honestly, Jasmine, when I read about that, I'm like, "Oh my god, that makes perfect sense." It absolutely resonated with me. Again, I'm not a big cook and, baker. Like I
Right.
said, my kitchen's like a lonely place sometimes. But anyway, but when I do it, and of
Mhm.
course, other people who do it, I mean, especially during COVID, I mean, this is what I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you. COVID, all of a
Mhm.
sudden people started baking.
I
Right?
know.
I mean, there was like
Yeah.
a flour shortage at stores, right?
Yeah.
Because so
Yeah.
many people were baking bread and cookies and
Right.
baked goods. And so clearly there's already some evidence right there that people were baking to feel better. It was therapeutic, it was soothing. So there is definitely something there.
Yeah, I know that was actually a really exciting thing that I started noticing, especially like I think that was early pandemic, but I mean, it's continuing on for sure.
Yeah.
But when you, like you said, there was a shortage of flour and yeast, and everyone around the world was
Yes.
just baking, not cooking, but specifically baking too, which I thought, again, it sort of, I don't know, I felt like it testified to these hunches that I was getting because I like to argue again, when you ask people, typically you'll say, I'm a cook or I'm a baker. Like it's one or the other. And I think that there's something to that where cooking, it's like you can be a lot more loose with it. You can improvise. Whereas baking, you need to be very precise. There's a
Yes.
structure. And so right now, especially at the beginning of the pandemic when nothing was like, what do you expect? Everything was just so out of the ordinary that I think people craved that structure and method. And that is what was so healing and comforting, something that you could actually control.
Right.
So that's what I'd like to argue is even more healing, perhaps, in baking versus just cooking. And I think both can certainly be healing, but perhaps used with different demographics and needs. Like if you need more structure or something that helps you breathe and slow down, then
Right.
definitely with baking. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I that makes total sense to me for sure. So, because look, I love watching the Great British Baking Show.
Oh yeah.
That is
I know that's
seriously
like
one of my
super
favorite.
favorite
Right,
people see.
I would think you would love it too. I love
Yeah.
that show because I do find it soothing to watch
Mhm.
it. Something
Right.
about watching these people bake and creating these beautiful baked goods with
Right.
this incredible result. right?
Yeah.
I just find it so mesmerizing.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any
So
method. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So it makes total sense. I think that is a great avenue for you to go down for sure with all of the skills that you have. And because you obviously, there's something about you that wants to continually give back, right? You
Yeah.
want to be of service, which is, of course, fantastic. So very proud of you on that front too. So, all right. So I did show you my cookies before. So
Yeah.
let's talk about just basic baking do's and don'ts. So my little gingerbread man, I know he's so cute,
Yeah.
isn't he?
Oh,
He's so
yeah. It's so
adorable.
tasty.
I know. But I mean, some of my cookies come out a little dry.
Mhm.
And I mean, I think it's also because, like you say, it's very precise, but sometimes I want to reduce, like, I don't want to put too much butter and too much sugar or whatever. So, what are some basic baking things that you have learned along the way that you can share with people who want to, bake at home?
Sure. Yeah. So, typically the culprit for dry baked goods is an over measuring of flour. So, I mean, I don't know how serious people will be in their kitchen, but I do think a kitchen scale always comes in super handy. That's the most accurate way of measuring your flour. When people
Oh,
measure flour, if you're not familiar with baking, I think people tend to compact the flour into like say a cup of flour. And flour, the way it's measured, if you compact it in like that, you're over measuring actually. So the way that I was taught is the spoon and level method. If you don't have a kitchen scale, it's best to measure 1 cup of flour by like spooning in the flour like on top, let it kind of heap up and then like scrape off.
oh,
That's a more accurate
accurate.
measure
Okay.
of flour, but the most accurate way would be a kitchen scale and like
Scale.
go that way. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so flour, like I guess it's easy to think about dry ingredients, wet ingredients. The drier ingredients there is in a cookie, it'll be drier versus
Yeah.
like eggs and the fats like butter will make it a little bit more tender and moist. So,
Right. Right. And quality of ingredients probably makes a
oh,
difference
sure.
too. Right.
Sure. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, but I know that not everyone has like the access to really high quality ingredients all the time, and especially again with I don't know what's going to happen with the pandemic now. Hopefully, it'll start going in a direction where we can reopen. But if not, and we come again. Like against another like scarcity of ingredients, then I use just Costco butter or whatever
Yeah.
to just it still works.
Yeah, yeah, butter is always good, period.
Yeah.
So, yes, yeah, okay. And then in terms of holiday, baking and cookies, are there any favorites that you have that you like to make? Or when you're not having to do it for work, do you not wanna bake? Like,
I
how does
know.
that work
I
for you?
kind of ran into a little bit of that
Yeah,
where I was doing so much because of my work that I really like going to other bakeries and buying their baked goods and just seeing.
right.
um, but my favorite's always the classic chocolate chip cookie.
Mm,
So I like baking that. Like nothing beats a really fresh, like straight out of the oven chocolate chip cookie. I like mine with a little
that's
bit
true.
of sea salt sprinkled on top. So
Ooh,
yeah,
that's a good idea.
yeah.
Okay. All right. Not that I'm gonna run and make chocolate chip cookies anytime soon, but that's a really good tip. Okay. And Jasmine, we were talking about this before we started the interview, but your logo
Oh, right, yeah.
is I love this because I read about it on your website, and being Korean, the
Mhm.
logo is a beautiful logo. And anybody who looked at it, they'd be like, "Oh, that's kind of like a modern looking flower," right?
Uh-huh.
But it's actually the logo of yakgwa, which is the Korean cookie.
Yes,
So
yeah.
again, tell me about and tell everyone about the evolution of why you chose this logo and the significance, because it's a combination of what you're doing now and your intentions.
Yeah, the yakwa just felt like the most perfect embodiment of everything that I'm doing. Again, it's part of my Korean heritage. I loved that snack as a little kid. For those who don't know what yakwa is, it's actually like a fried dough that is soaked in honey.
It's
And
heaven. That's what it
yeah,
is. It is heavenly.
it's super delicious. I yeah, and honey back then, or like yakwa literally translates to medicinal snack. And so, honey was thought to be very medicinal in its properties back then. And so for me, using baking as a healing method, I just felt like that yakwa was the perfect symbol for everything that I'm trying to do.
It
Yeah.
really is perfect. And for those of you who have never had yakwa, run and get some. I'm telling you, I took it once to a friend of mine's party. They're, Caucasian, and they'd
Uh-huh.
never been exposed to like traditional Korean stuff, right? So I took them a batch of yakwa. I bought it at the store. I didn't make it. And I gave it to them and they tried it. And Catherine, my friend, freaked out. She's like, what is this that I've never experienced before in my life? I mean, she went nuts.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Oh
it's,
my
yeah, she
gosh.
loved it. She's like, May, these are so sinful, but I cannot stop eating them. I'm like, I know. We know, we
Yeah,
peeps know how to make stuff.
yeah.
But yeah, I love that logo. I think it's so perfect. I would
Thank
imagine that your parents must be very proud of you.
They are now.
I know. That's what I was gonna say. I bet initially they were like, she's crazy. What is she doing? She's not following the traditional track of, doctor, lawyer, engineer, whatever. But uh, did it take a while for them to come around?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's funny. I just talked about yakwa being a medicinal snack,
Yeah.
but at the beginning, when I was first starting on this whole baking journey, my dad actually said, like, "Oh, how are you going to make money
Yeah.
making snacks?" Or like, "What are you doing?" That's what he didn't even call it like baking or cookies. I was like, "What are you doing making snacks?" Of course, like I know, like again, my parents are coming from a place of concern and worry, and
Yes.
like but it's just interesting because ultimately my dad is an entrepreneur, but his business is martial arts, and so
Yeah.
it's very different. And he knows martial arts. I'm sure I just kind of think about, if you don't know anything about martial arts, you might have that same sort of like, oh, how are you going to make a living teaching martial arts,
Yeah.
but yeah, I guess as the world started to pay attention to my work, and that recognition came, I think it's sort of the same with my parents. Like as the world paid attention, they paid more attention.
Yeah.
And especially my mom, she's always been super supportive actually, but she very regularly says how proud she is. And
Oh.
you know it's interesting too because we never really talked about race or our heritage and how that impacted our lived experiences.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was something that was really gratifying to hear my mom specifically say, "I'm so proud of you. You're Korean and you're telling people about Korean culture and Asian identity." And for her to like verbalize that was very impactful to me. So
That's powerful. That is
yes,
powerful that it hit your mother that way to the
right.
point where she expressed it to you.
Yeah, yeah,
So, because you're
absolutely.
right. I think Asian immigrants, like my parents, or that generation, they're not going to talk about, the hardships of racism and identity, things like that. But the fact that your mother is recognizing the work that you're doing,
Yeah,
that's pretty amazing.
yes,
Ye-
super
Yeah,
amazing. Yeah,
and Korean parents, they're tough, man. They're not going to say, "Well, I'm proud of you" very often. Even if they are
right.
internally, they're not going to verbalize it that
Yeah.
often.
Right. But
Yeah.
they do now, and I'm
Oh,
so grateful. Yeah. I think I'm so grateful for my parents. I think they're the type of people who have continued to evolve. Sometimes it's easy. I feel like I see this trend in older adults kind of being static,
yeah.
but my parents, I've seen them grow like along with me and like most people. So
That's
so
great.
that's been very, yeah, just I respect and admire them so much.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. No, I think that's wonderful to hear that. So, well, I am certainly proud of you, Jasmine, and I'm so glad I found you. I mean, that's the beauty of social media and, obviously being able to find interesting stories and people, but you absolutely I was like, I got to get her. She's perfect. So, I'm
Thank
so
you.
glad you were able to come on and share your story and share your
Right.
beautiful artwork because it truly is
Thank
artwork.
thank you.
And I can't wait to continue following you to see the work that you're doing, but keep it up. Definitely
Yeah,
keep it
thank
up.
you. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
All right. Well, stay safe during the holidays and
Love
hopefully at some point we can meet face to face and
that.
maybe at one point when you have a moment I'll order like my own portrait at some point. So,
course. Yeah.
But until then, keep lifting up those stories of heroes from the API community, because I think that's really important.
Thank you so much.
Okay, take care, Jasmine.
Thank you, you too. Happy holidays.
Well, that was fun. I knew it would be. I'm glad I decided to do this episode because there's nothing better than talking about cookies, baking, and then having a purpose in life to enhance important figures in AAPI history and modern history. So, Jasmine, thank you so much. Keep up the good work. Seriously, what an artist, but what an amazing individual who has found her purpose. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I want everyone to please have a safe and happy and festive holiday season. I know it's weird and unusual. We just got to get through this. We're going to get through it because it's going to get better with all these vaccines coming down the pike. But we just need to play it safe, okay? Just keep it up. We all have COVID fatigue, but you know what? Go bake something. Go bake something like I did. And these bourbon balls, I mean, I can't even imagine if I ate this whole plate, I would be so hammered. Wow. Okay. But, just find something to keep your spirits up. It is the holidays. It's different. It's weird, but we're going to get through it. We got to get through it together. Okay. And one last thing I mentioned now at the end of my shows, if you would like to support the show, The Mei Lee Show, and you want to become a patron, we do have a Patreon page at patreon.com/The Mei Lee Show. And we have 3 different levels of support. One is warriors. 2, the second tier, you can become a dedicated warrior. And the highest level is badass warrior. And you get different things depending on what tier you join. So it's, totally up to you. If you would like to support the show in that way, that's great. Or else, if you haven't followed us yet on Instagram or Facebook, or you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, go ahead and do so. Always appreciate that support. And if you want to go to Apple Podcasts and rate our show, give it a rating. 5-star rating would be awesome. Or you can review the show. That would be great too. So any way you can to support the show, totally appreciate it. All right. So I'm going to go eat some bourbon balls. Did I call them rum balls before? They're bourbon balls. I'm going to have some bourbon balls for lunch. Okay. Merry Christmas, everyone. Happy holidays. I'll see you next time.